Welcome back, and many thanks for staying with us right here on Morning at NTV. What strategies have we laid forward to ensure that we conquer the energy space in this country? We did have a colours report as soon as Friday last week. Yes, experts are saying we might soon hit 1.5 degrees Celsius as far as global warming is concerned. That is a recipe for disaster because of many of the governments have failed to actually embark on green or renewable energy during this COVID-19 pandemic. What are some of those factors or underlying factors or the push factors leading up to this or dampening their resolve to actually make that switch? I do have David Ofungi Obikado. He is the CEO and founder of Dero and also the curator of Makutano. I would like to talk about that and a lot more. They are now working with another partner, the United Nations Capital Development Fund. They sent an expert, that is Joshua Kabugo, the digital and energy finance specialist, with whom we are going to be expounding more on this very pertinent conversation. So what is the Makutano? 2019, it was largely banking on ICT. They were taking a look at science, technology, and so forth, innovation. Fast forward to 2020, the Makutano was actually focusing on holding debates, focusing on how best we can seek alternative sources of funding for our local governments. 2021, here we are, and we're talking about renewable energy, and we're talking about conquering the energy space. And this conversation couldn't have come at the right time, now that global warming temperatures are increasing and might soon hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. All right, gentlemen, a very good morning, and thank you for joining us on Morning at NTV.
It's good to be here.
All right, like I did mention, David, this conversation couldn't have come at the right time now that we are soon hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming temperatures. How significant, how important is it for governments to make that switch to renewable energy during this COVID-19 pandemic and moving forward?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having us here. I think principally there's a recognition that there's a transition in the energy space.
Right.
And Uganda has an interesting predicament given the fact that we're a new oil country.
Yes.
So we have a responsibility to harness and harvest that new resource, but also realize that there's got to be an energy mix that accommodates renewables, so that there's a balance between fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels. So I think what government is doing quite a number of things that are laudable. I think first, I think a couple of weeks ago they passed the Climate Change Act that has guidance on how multiple sectors should address the issues around climate change mitigation and adaptation, which includes the aspects of financing that Joshua is going to talk about. And then other than that, I think in the energy space or electricity space, there's an important aspect around increasing the component of off-grid power, most of which is renewable. So through wind, solar, and maybe geothermal. So that's a strategy that's in place, and I think we're heading in the right direction.
Well, according to the United Nations and other development partners, they've noticed that so many governments have failed to make that switch to renewable energy. Why has it been hard for them, in your own perspective, as David Ofungi?
I think the existing infrastructure, so unbundling or unpacking existing infrastructure and the power of the incumbents is something that I think I give the example sometimes that it's very hard to turn an oil tanker. So maneuvering the transition, given our reliance on trucks and the underlying energy through diesel and everything else is going to be hard. But I think one of the key paradigm shifts that we're recognizing right now is that where greening used to be peripheral and a cost center, technology and adoption has reached the scale where it's profitable to make those changes. So that where the money goes, the transition follows.
Are you worried that we might regress when it comes to making that switch to renewable energy and also increasing the adverse effects of climate change if we continue with the oil exploration within the Albertan region? If we are not careful putting in place some mitigating measures to ward off climate change, do you think there's a big problem within Bunyoro?
I think that there's been a very diligent process around making sure that the exploitation of the oil resource in Bunyoro is done in a manner that is
environmental,
that accommodates environmental sensitivities. So I think that process, the Albertan Rift in itself is one of the a global endowment in terms of tourism is concerned. So those considerations are being put in place. Interestingly, if you look at Total, who is a huge player in our market, they're talking a lot about the energy transition. They have rebranded themselves, and I think what happens as well right now is the funders also need to make sure that the projects in themselves are sustainable. So
Indeed.
I think the ecosystem is changing.
Indeed. As government goes a long way in putting in place measures, mitigating measures to ensure that they ward off the adverse effects of climate change, other partners are also doing the most. I'm talking about the United Nations Capital Development Fund. I'm talking about the Makutano. Well, talk to us about the Makutano, David Ofungi. What is it all about? In 2019, we saw you focus on debates largely around ICT 2020, local governments strategizing ways through which we could actually finance them rather than taking a look at taxes.
Yeah.
2021, what is the Makutano focusing on and why?
I'll give you a bit of background of why we came up with this. I think it is, there's a realization that there's two aspects of these fora that we thought were missing. I think one, the conversation has to accommodate all stakeholders, so private sector and the public sector and development partners such as UNCDF.
Indeed.
And then get subject matter that resonates with our national development plan. So everything that we've done over the past 3-4 years has been principally aligned with our economic agenda.
Indeed.
And then I think what's most important is that you make sure that it's not a conference where the most exciting thing is the lunch buffet or the cocktail after. What are the action points that have been agreed?
Indeed.
And then we take them forward. And I'll give you a quick example about last year.
Walking the talk.
So we did alternative finance in local government, again, with UNCDF support. And the conclusion of that was that there were some changes that were required in the Local Government Act and a couple of other acts in our laws. And that informed a cabinet paper that was taken to cabinet. And there's a process of making amendments based on the discussions that came out of that fora. And we want to replicate it with this theme around energy, which I think is a more intimate gathering because we'll still have the economic conversation, but now we're having little buckets that are specific to sectors. And we couldn't have done it without the kind support, technical and financial from the likes of UNCDF.
Of course. David Ofungi Obikado, curator, also CEO and founder of DERO. Let's also bring in Joshua Kabogo. He's working with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We'd like to know what is the role of the United Nations Capital Development Fund in a conversation on energy?
So I think that with development,
Yes, Kabogo.
with this kind of development, you will need different aspects to come together. You'll need money to come in, you'll need energy, especially energy, and one of the key things we've come across, I think David was just alluding to this, is for that transition to happen, for development to work up, for things to progress naturally, there has to be funding, money has to come through, but just having money isn't enough. So having the money being used for the right resources is going to be important, for the right functions is going to be important. So one of the things that has to be done, industrialization happens because it's energy.
Indeed.
And so having money in the industry sector is good, but if there's no energy to support the industry sector, there's nothing that's going to happen. So what the UNCDF is trying to do is to be able to catalyze the development process by focusing on key things, focusing on, for example, what they did the year before last or last year was being able to fund local governments, right? Because there's infrastructure that needs to be developed.
Indeed.
That's one thing. Second,
And the taxes can't be enough.
It can't be enough. I mean, we're not able to get enough money through taxes, so there has to be different sources of money.
All right. That's why you're coming.
Yes. I wish I had a big bucket of money that I could just pour on the table, but
I love the patriotism.
The second thing,
Go ahead.
So energy has to be funded. And what we're trying to do is bring partners together. So what UNCDF's role is quite simple, actually, is to bring the different players together, and make sure we have these conversations, but more than just having conversations, we want to be able to action these conversations. That's what happens. Just you and I sitting around having a conversation is good, but if there's
implementing the outcome,
that, something has to be done. We have to have where's the money going, who has been funded, what projects are they doing, where's the energy going, who has got access as a result of this conversation. That's what we're trying to do. That's UNCDF's role, really.
What are some of the key conversations we must have about energy in Uganda, Mr. Kabuko?
I think there has to be different pieces. Again, I think David already alluded to some of the things. I think there has to be pieces to do with who's getting the funding, where's it coming from, what's the cost of that funding. So the finance piece is important. The second piece that's important is for the partnerships. How do people play together? Because there's no way we are going to progress this agenda without having people play together. There's just no way. The third one has to be about policy and regulation and how this is happening. And there's already things being done to progress policy and regulation. There's the reviews being done of the off-grid energy policy. There's all these things coming through the pipeline, And again, we talked about Uganda being an oil country now, and there's a sincere and actual acknowledgement that sustainability has to be a piece an ingrained piece in the development process. So the conversations we have to have are going to be multiple fold, especially one is finance, regulation, stakeholder engagement and partnerships. All these things have to be talked about, and proper discussions have to be had that then move forward, progress the agenda, move the agenda forward.
So you are positioning yourself as people who are going to be funding these initiatives. Are you also going to be expediting mass sensitization campaigns among our populations so that we can help them make that switch from charcoal burning to maybe renewable energy, because we need to get into their brain so that they could make that switch? We could pour money into these initiatives, but if we do not actually educate our individuals in this country, it might be futile. Would you agree? I
would agree, actually. You can't put it any better, you know. There is, again, we start saying that there's a whole lot of money being put in, but if there's nothing being done to move this forward, then it won't really be progressive. So the campaigns will be hard, maybe by ourselves, maybe by our partners. The idea for us to be able to bring in everyone to do the best they do.
Right? Oh, this is my idea. This is the kind of money I need to get on the ground, and then you and CDF comes in.
Push that in, and we're like, okay, so if David can bring us together, that's good. If you can bring money, that's good. If someone else can bring ideas, if Airtel comes along and says, you know what, I can give you maybe free ad space to get sensitization going. So bring those players together and we'll push the agenda forward. So yes, it has to be done. There has to be mass sensitization. Whether we do it ourselves or we have our partners do it, that's a bit of a decision to make. But there has to be, we cannot forego that, because there's nothing that can be done without the public knowing what has to be.
Digital and energy finance specialist Joshua Kavugo, he is working with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. David Ofungi is still here. Let's talk about some of the gaps you've noticed within our energy space. What are some of them, and where do we stand as a country as far as energy is concerned?
So I think, first of all, I think we have to applaud what government did. I think there's two principal actions that happened. I think the passing of the 1999 Electricity Act that allowed for private sector participation in the generation, distribution, and a portion of transmission, but not so much, was the first thing. And then you've seen a ramp up in capacity. But we have an interesting problem right now with Karuma on board. I think there's about 2,000 or thereabouts megawatts. So there's surplus power, which requires the consumer. So that, as Joshua was alluding to,
indeed, there's surplus power, but fewer people are connected to the same power.
Yes, connectivity is an issue. So we need investment in transmission and distribution infrastructure. We also need that industrialization story to manifest, so that you have off-takers that are in a position to do that. I think the finance discussion is interesting. Like I said earlier, there's a mechanism through private-public partnerships. I happen to sit on the PPP board, actually. And then obviously the capital markets, where you can get project finance and green finance, is a mechanism that would allow for, say, pension funds to put their money into the energy space. So those are the two things. I think it's a scale issue. When you get scale, the cost of funding should come down, and the offtake should be competitive in that space, I think.
Indeed. What are some of the gaps you've noticed?
The gaps in our power space? I think that the hot story right now is about renewables, and renewables that are off-grid. So I think it's incumbent around the regulator to make sure that the regulations are sensitive to the dynamics around off-grid power, cost of funding, tenure of concessions, what happens when the grid catches up with that off-grid power. Those are the things that I think need to be addressed. And then I think the big elephant in the room is transmission. Transmission infrastructure to get that power from Isimba and from Karuma, among others. So I think that conversation is happening, but those wheels require private sector participation to fund them. And I think when we get that right, then we just fuel the industrialization agenda in NDP3.
But because of poverty, we've regressed when it comes to many of these interventions. Many of our people still use charcoal to actually go ahead with many of the activities in their households. What kind of strategies are you putting together as the Makutano to actually ensure that we actually stop this practice from taking center stage? We can pour a lot of money into these ventures, but if we do not stop people from burning charcoal, cutting down trees for home consumption and so forth, we are still knee deep in quagmire. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree, and I think when we go to biomass, I think it's 80 or 90% of our cooking fuel comes out of that. The biggest victims of that are the communities themselves that are energy poor and need a source of revenue. So I think there has to be a competitive mechanism around sustainable stoves and the fuel that goes behind it to ensure that the rural, mostly rural or peri-urban consumer are energy security. I think my role as a curator is to make sure that the brains like Joshua come through and unpack these things. They have projects in that space. Umeme is having interesting conversations around facilitating that same constituency. So we're getting these people together to unpack these issues, but we provoke the thought and then we let the experts tackle them, and then we will certainly push that into a policy.
Let's allow sensitization start from here. Let's acquaint the viewer with some of the ramifications that would befall this nation if we continue embarking on deforestation, cutting down on trees. Effect of deforestation on our environment.
I mean, Joshua, I'm sure can add some points here, but we're seeing this in terms of, I mean, your increased prevalence of landslides, and then I think floods, food security, what happens with disease prevalence in areas where the environment is changing. I think climate change.
The locust invasion.
Exactly.
I mean, you went to their habitat, you cut down the trees. So what do? They have to vacate and find a new home. And that's when they invade your gardens.
And yes, and what we're saying, and we've always made the argument that the shift comes when it's economically more viable to conserve rather than to deplete. And we haven't quite fixed it. But I think you have, Joshua, some programs that are trying to address it.
All right. Go ahead, Joshua. What are some of those programs?
There is programs that are trying to push this. But I think, let me start from the piece where it says it's not yet at the point where it's economically more viable. We have, for example, businesses that are doing clean cook stoves. And they're supposed to reduce the amount of fuel you use to cook. Businesses that are doing, partners we're supporting that are doing briquettes, which replace, in terms of cooking, which replace charcoal. And then we have businesses supporting that, for example, using rocks, volcanic rocks as cooking fuel. And the reason why we support the different players that bring different ideas is because we know that for it to get to a point where it's economically viable, there has to be scale. And if you get to a point where there is scale, where this can be done at scale, then we can find that piece that's missing that I think you talked about, where we haven't gotten the part, again, we said, we haven't got the part where it's economically viable, but when we do get to that part, it will make a whole lot, it will be easier for us to. So I think the bottom line is the sensitization will work, but it won't work on its own. There has different pieces coming together. And until it makes business sense for a business entrepreneur or for a person in their home to stop needing to cut down a tree to get fuel, it will be difficult for us to expect sensitization to come and work on its own.
Indeed. You want to add on that?
And I just think one more point, and within the construct of this event we're having tomorrow, is that we have a parallel deal room. So there's a plenary and a deal room where these companies that Joshua is talking about are going to interface with a spectrum of funders, everyone from commercial, development banks, project finance, PE, and these business plans are going to be unpacked, and those that are bankable should have that funding in place. We will keep monitoring it and make sure that the scale that's required is attained. All
right, gentlemen, how can one attend the Economic Makutano? Kabogo, before I let you go.
Well, we have set up a registration link. David's going to talk about this before because they are the curators. Our role is facilitating mostly, but there'll be there's two events running in parallel, right? The plenary and then the deal room. The deal room is mostly for the partners to access potential investors on a one-on-one, have these conversations, and then the plenary is to be able to support the pieces that come. The enabling pieces have to be kind of dealt with. Have the key conversations that we talked about.
All right.
But he will give the details regarding the attendance and what needs to be done.
All right. What needs to be done? Who can attend? How can they attend? And what plans do you have for the energy space in Uganda going forward?
Okay. The attendance is obviously within the SOPs, the COVID protocol. So we have a hybrid event. There's an invitation list of partners and relevant parties at Mestil Hotel. But we'll be streaming live on all platforms.
Right.
Our Twitter account, our Facebook, and I believe there'll be some content here as well.
Already.
The energy...
There's content already.
I beg your pardon? there is content right now.
Yes.
And we have two interesting keynotes. We have the group chairman of Standard Bank, who is going to give us his ideas about the economic transition fueled by renewables. And then we have a climate change expert based in the UK talking about COP26. So there's an interesting spectrum of parties. So please.
The viewers will look forward to that. The Makutano conversation on energy. Thank you, David, and also Kabugo for coming through. Indeed. You're still watching Morning at NTV. I have Rashul Adidi from Koboko ready to update.